This is episode 108 of the Magic Detective Podcast. On this episode, you'll hear about the life of Paul Valadon. That and more on this episode of the Magic Detective Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Magic Detective Podcast, your podcast home for magic history. I'm your host, Dean Carnegie. I am the Magic Detective, and this is episode 108. Well, hello, my friends. Believe it or not, I started this podcast in late 2024 with the hopes of getting it out before the end of, before the start of the new year. And, now we're into the new year and it's still just now getting out. A few things have happened. I started with one topic and then switched to another and then got diverted to a third, and it was all purely by accident. But then another thing happened. I started releasing some of my magic-related artwork back in December. And if you're not aware, I am a painter besides being a magician. And back about 25 years or so ago, I began doing paintings of famous magicians. And I tried various styles. One of them got me a lot of attention, which was kind of an abstract caricature sort of thing. And I had done things like that back in my teenage years, but now I wanted to try it again. It was seeming that style was getting kind of popular. I had noticed there were a number of illustrators in magazines that were using a similar type of very abstract kind of style, combining shapes and things to create images of famous people. Anyway, I threw my hat into the ring with my own versions, and people took notice. I even appeared in Magic Magazine with some of my artwork, so that was pretty cool. And my artwork has appeared in books and other magazines, other magic magazines, art-related magazines, even on a TV show at one point. So fast forward to today, I was kind of surprised by the response that I got from people. And I started selling pieces that, and that, quite frankly, has kept me kind of busy. In fact, I've sort of fallen back into the art-minded mode, which I have not had in quite a long time. I've been consumed by art lately, watching art shows, studying art, doing sketches for new pieces, plus touching up some of my older pieces and releasing some of them. I expect to release another piece very soon, and I'm doing some touch-up work on it. And I think that one I'm going to release on the Magic Detective group page via video. So I'll do a video reveal. It's the first time I've done that. And I may put it over on the Magic Detective page, because there's two. One's a group that's private, and the other one is open to the public. Anyway, if you see my artwork and you're interested in purchasing it, and by the way, these are originals. These are not prints. These are originals for now. If you're interested in purchasing any of them, you can reach me at info@carnegiemagic.com, and please put art in the subject heading. Okay? So, really quick, a big thank you to everybody that purchased a set of my lecture notes on Robert Kellar. And to give you some of my own magic history, this is like the fourth set of lecture notes that I've produced. The first was for a lecture I did for a local magic club. I think I produced like 30 or 40 sets of those. And initially, I only sold like 10. And then I took the rest of them up to Denny Haney at Denny and Lee's Magic Studio in Baltimore, and he sold all my notes in a few days' time and asked me for more, but that was all I had. So it pays to have the right distributor. The next set of lecture notes I had were called the One and Done lecture notes for a lecture I did for the Cadabra Conference in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. It's also where I was given the name The Magic Detective by the convention organizer, Mark Daniel. All of those sold out at the convention. And then, let me see, lecture note 3. That was for a lecture I did that I ended up getting sick and I couldn't attend it. So that's a long story. And lecture note 4, those were the Robert Kellar notes, which Turned out pretty good. They weren't exactly the way I wanted them printed, but I was happy with them in the end, and and eventually sold quite a few thanks to folks buying them on eBay. So thanks. And let me see. I almost forgot. There was one other thing. I wrote 2 books called the Escape Biz books on the art of escapology as a business. And I wrote these along with my friend Steve Baker, Mr. Escape. You may have heard of him. His sections were all dictated over the phone. And basically, they were just conversations we had over the phone, and I had to take and jot down notes and put his ramblings into some coherent stuff, and was able to write his sections in the book, and they turned out pretty good. There were 2 volumes, and they've been long out of print, and I keep getting emails and text messages from escape artists saying, hey, are you going to re-release those, or do you have any extra copies? So I think I'm actually going to re-release the Escape Biz books later this year. Probably a very small quantity, so I will keep you informed when that happens. And so that is that, and let's talk about today. I've been doing research on George White, the assistant for Thurston, when I came upon this strange article in the Sphinx magazine. It was a letter reprinted from Howard Thurston to the readers, and it had to do with the poor health of Paul Valadon. And basically, Thurston was trying to start a GoFundMe page 100 years before such a thing even existed. And I read this, and I was like, what is going on here? I don't know anything about this. The only thing I know about Valadon is the Harry Kellar connection. So this led me on a down the rabbit hole, as they say, and leads us to today's episode. In the summer months of 1867, Adolf Waber was born. At a young age, he saw a magician and eventually went to work for him as an assistant and likely apprentice. That magician was Ernest Bosch, who performed out of Hamburg, Germany. Bosch came from a family of magicians. 3 of his brothers were also magicians at some point in their lives. Eventually, young Adolf, who would eventually change his name to Paul Valadon, he had learned enough that he went out on his own. He started in Germany, but ventured out all over Europe. From there, he toured the major cities of South Africa. Valadon was known for his manipulative skill and high talent. He was a master of billiard ball manipulations. He was adept at card manipulations. Some of his moves can be found in the Modern Conjurer's book by C. Lang Neil. He even created a second sight act with his wife, Catherine. Over at Egyptian Hall, David Devant had just departed, and the Masculines were looking for a new magician to bring on board. They heard the accolades about Valadon and offered him a job at the famed hall. Paul Valadon would accept the position and over a 5-year span present over 1,600 performances. Valadon would perform his own act as well as assist in others. He was one of the cast members for the Will, the Witch, and the Watchman routine, for example. He also created original routines while at Egyptian Hall. The drum that can't be beat was a creation of Valadon's. He would show a cylindrical drum missing the drum heads. Then he would place the drum heads on and suspend the drum from 2 chains on the stage. He then poked a hole in one of the drum heads and slowly removed large scarves, one after another, filling the stage with silk. Another of his creations was an illusion called Well-I'm. This he built with the help of the Masculines. It was a table maybe about 3 feet off the ground. He would have his wife stand on top of the table. He would walk around the table and then step on the table standing next to her. And then he would take a large cloth and cover her. It would flow over her, showing only the outline of her body. After a few magical gestures, he would dramatically yank the cloth away, and his wife would vanish into thin air. And I can attest to the beauty of both of these effects. I believe, by the way, the drum that can't be beat went on to be sold as a dealer item and was featured by many performers over the years. But Mike Caveney recreated both of these effects for one of the LA Magic history conferences, and then later presented them via video at the Essential Magic Conference in Portugal. And I was able to see the video version, and I can say that both were truly wonderful mysteries. Now we have to introduce Harry Kellar into the picture. During the summer months, when artists routinely took a break, Kellar would go to England, and specifically Egyptian Hall, to see the latest creations of masculine. Somehow, these creations would later turn up the following year in Kellar's show. Now, much has been made of Kellar's stealing these effects, but I'm starting to wonder, and here's why. Kellar fell in love with the levitation, for example, and he offered to buy it from Masculine, but Masculine turned down the offer. Kellar would return to the show time and again, trying to solve the mystery. In fact, there's one anecdote that said Kellar actually climbed on stage during a performance to look under the floating girl. And just as one of Masculine's assistants was going to stop him, Mr. Masculine himself prevented the stagehand from interfering. Now that is odd on many levels. First, would Kellar be so rude as to jump on stage during a show? And why would Masculine want such audacity to be prevented? Or why he would, not want it to be prevented. Oh, and then add to this, there are stories of both the Masculines and the Kellars having dinner together. Now, I find all of this quite strange. I'm not sure I believe the story of him climbing up on the stage. I do kind of believe the dinner story, believe it or not. But then why would John Neville Masculine have dinner with a man who was stealing his material? Unless, well, I'll leave that for you to figure out. One thing is for sure, in 1904, Kellar went to England and stayed for a very short time. But when he returned, he came back having hired Paul Valadon for his fall tour. Valadon clearly loved working at Egyptian Hall. In fact, Valadon would later say one of his prized possessions was a letter of recommendation from John Neville Masculine. So why could he be persuaded to leave? This piece I found in the pages of the book Kellar's Wonders by Mike Caveney and Bill Mizell. Apparently, it turns out in 1904, well, that was going to be the final year for Egyptian Hall. This was due to the fact that the building was going to be demolished that year. So now I'm wondering who approached who. Did Valadon, knowing that he'd soon be out of work, approach Kellar? Or did Kellar, as the popular story goes, hire Valadon to get the secret to the levitation? Now, this is where the popular story begins. Kellar, desperately wanting the secret to the masculine levitation, hires Paul Valadon, partly with the promise of including him in the show and potentially turning the show over to him when Kellar retires. Did they speak of the secret to the levitation at this time? Boy, that seems like a breach of protocol and ethics for Valadon to do such a thing, especially given the fact he holds Masculine in such high regard. And then there's this weird note that Houdini put down after talking to Kellar, and it said that Kellar was awfully hurt to think that people said he had hired Valadon for the purpose of stealing the levitation secrets. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't do it, but it just makes the whole thing a little bit more confusing. The official record says that Kellar had the masculine levitation in 1904. However, I have in my files a program from the Providence Opera House dated April 6th, 1903. On page 6, the program reads, "In the great hypnotic scene, The Levitation, of Princess Karnak. That's a full year before he even meets Valadon. Confused yet? Now, whether he stole it, acquired the secrets from Valadon, or had a third party help work it out, I just don't know for sure. Certainly there was a third party who shall remain nameless. Kellar's version allowed for the illusion to move from theater to theater. Maskelyne's levitation was built into the theater. Obviously, there were some issues that had to be solved or remade in order to make the illusion transportable. Now let's look at what Paul Valadon did when he worked for Kellar. Now I'm speaking specifically of his magic. Thanks to what has turned out to be a rather controversial review by John Northern Hilliard, we have much information. All the secret stuff and the methods that Hilliard included in his initial article have been withheld for this podcast because, as you know, I don't reveal secrets. So, the beginning of his act, Valadon removes his gloves, tosses them into the air, where they transform into a dove. Next, we have the popular soup plate illusion created by Decoulta. And then we have aerial treasury, or the miser's dream. And from here, Valadon goes into billiard ball manipulations. Next up, we have some fun manipulations with raw eggs, eventually pulling eggs from a spectator's mouth. The next feat received praise from multiple sources. It's a small effect, but a standout. A strip of blue paper about 30 inches long and 1 inch wide is torn into multiple pieces and then barehandedly restored. And by all accounts, it was a very beautiful piece of magic. The Sphinx in a later issue mentions that Valadon had removed this piece from his show, and the commentator said it was one of the most beautiful effects Valadon did, and he hoped that it would eventually return to the show at some point. This effect is now followed by card manipulations, and this is a fairly brief sequence because though Valadon was an expert, the whole card manipulation thing was a very new genre, so there were not a lot of probably not what we think of today as card manipulations, just the front and back thingamajiggy. And now we get to the watch trick. A borrowed watch is made to vanish and reappear in an impossible location. And the final trick, at least in the beginning, was the drum that can't be beat, which I described earlier. Eventually on the tour, Valadon would present his illusion, Well, I'm, and Kellar even had posters made to this effect with an image of Valadon performing the effect. The title, Well, I'm, is also on the poster. The top of the poster reads, Kellar's Mysteries, and then the lower right says, presented by Paul Valadon. And incidentally, after Valadon eventually leaves the Kellar show, Harry Kellar would continue to present Well, I'm in his show, but it would be rechristened. It would be called his latest created wonder, Gone. And also, by the way, the Maskelines would also continue presenting Well, I'm on their stages as well, but they were also claiming they were the creators. The Kellar tours featuring Paul Valadon received great press reviews. The one exception was John Northern Hilliard, who would kind of go out of his way to bash Harry Kellar whenever possible. In 1905, Paul Valadon suggested to Kellar they add the Maskelyne trick called the Will, the Watch, and the Watchman to the show. It would require some new cast members, and by all accounts, the first attempts were atrocious. One thing about Harry Kellar, he was a genial old man, but when he lost his temper, he went off like a cannon. And he was furious at how this new routine was not coming along. And he fired everybody. Kellar's version would be called The Witch, the Sailor, and the Enchanted Monkey. He fired the new people that had been hired as members. He didn't fire the whole cast. Eventually, the routine was worked out enough to be playable. And by the way, if you read Jim Steinmeier's blog, you can watch a video of the original Maskelyne version of Will, the Witch, and the Watchman, featuring John Carney in one of the title roles. Kellar must not have been particularly fond of this illusion because at some point he sold it to a magician in the Midwest. Now back to Kellar and Valadon. According to the earlier agreement, Valadon was to take over the show when Kellar retired. There was only one small problem. Actually, two. One of the issues was Eva Kellar, Harry's wife. The other? Alcohol, of which Eva and Paul Valadon were known to partake in excess. Eva was apparently kind of a mean drunk and hated the Valadons, drunk or not. Mostly, Paul tried to hold his tongue, but one afternoon after hearing Mrs. Kellar badmouth them, Paul Valadon came out and ripped the wife of Harry Kellar to shreds verbally. And just like that, just like the vanish of his illusion, Valadon was out as far as being a successor. He did finish the tour, but after that, he was no longer part of the company. Now, this is something I found interesting. Paul Valadon, as well as a lot of performers at the time, would run a small ad in the back of the Sphinx magazine. And basically it would be there, would just give their name, a description of them, and then what their mailing address was while they were on the road. So here's what Valadon's little ad said. It says, in big letters, Paul Valadon. After that it says, late of England's home of mystery, the Egyptian Hall, London. Now touring in vaudeville with an entire new act. All communications, address care of Edward Beadle, 1193 Broadway, New York, New York. Now what's interesting here, no mention of touring with Kellar. The fallout left an everlasting rift between the two men. Now after the Kellar show, Valadon went on to perform in vaudeville across the United States, and by all accounts, he was a big success in vaudeville. He would change his act often, but the reviews of his shows were great. In the magic press, they still expected Valadon to move up to the top of the show business ladder. There's an interesting anecdote that comes from the pages of the Crest Magic magazine, March 1908. Apparently, Valadon was performing somewhere in America and needed to borrow someone's tall high hat, in other words, a top hat. But none were forthcoming, so he instructed his assistant to fetch his brand new top hat that was in his dressing room. This was in immaculate condition, a thing of pride for Valadon. And he asked for a gentleman to examine the hat, and he gave it to someone who then handled his hat rather coarsely and then tossed it back onto the stage. And Valadon, well, in short, he was furious. But he held his temper. He stepped over to retrieve his now somewhat mangled hat, and he said, quote, "And now, is there a gentleman who could examine the hat?" And the audience, of course, understood the gentle rebuke of the ruffian and laughed. There's a word we don't hear very often, ruffian. In April 1909, tragedy struck the Valadons while appearing in Chicago. Catherine Valadon, Paul's wife, got sick. In fact, she had been sick for several weeks. She was admitted to the hospital, but she died on April 27th at Mercy Hospital. She was buried in Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago. She was only 40 or 41 when she died. Notice of her death appeared in all the magic periodicals of the day. One had this quote, "She was liked by all who met her," which wasn't exactly true. Eva Kellar was no fan of her or her husband, but everybody else seemed to like her. This left Paul a single father with a young son. Still, the show must go on, and the show did go on. At one point, Valadon dropped the illusions and did a smaller act with his son, which was well received. It was a struggle at first doing the show without his wife, and yet the illusions wouldn't stay out of the show. In May of 1910, the Sphinx says that Valadon is featuring a beautiful levitation and disappearance of a woman. Quote, his act is better than ever and shows Valadon's master hand at conjuring, unquote. The next month in the Sphinx, Valadon is mentioned again, and it says, quote, showed his illusion of the vanishing lady while suspended in the air. So I assume he's presenting Leroy's Azra levitation. Okay, October 1910. The Sphinx spills more details. Quote, am somewhat late reporting the show of Paul Valadon, who appeared at the Majestic Theater here last month. When he stepped on stage the first night, he received a big round of applause, which showed he was well remembered favorably by the Chicago theatergoers. His act was a treat from start to finish, and the quick succession of surprises which he presented in his wonderful style brought forth many rounds of applause. He captured his audience's attention with the climax, which consisted of his own conception of Surveillant Leroy's illusion Azra. Did you catch that? His own conception of Surveillant Leroy's illusion Azra. Valadon brings the trick to a startling termination by causing the silk sheet to vanish, as well as the levitated body. His illusion is one of his own ideas and it is not one of the impractical copies that are being sold on the reputation gained by Surveillant Leroy's invention. It might be useful to many magicians to know that the many so-called Azra illusions now offered for sale are not anything like the original as invented by and presented by Surveillant Leroy, unquote. A later article mentions Valadon called his creation Venita. And I'm wondering if indeed, if this was not Leroy's method, perhaps he was using the clever method from his illusion Well I'm and added the levitation, because the elements are all there. The covering of the lady, the table, the vanishing of the figure. The only thing is there's no floating in Well I'm. It's very interesting. This could be a lost illusion. Life on the road seemed to be okay for Paul Valadon and his son. That is until 1911 and 1912. Paul Sr.'s health began to decline, and this is where my interest all started. In a January 15, 1912 issue of the Sphinx magazine, Howard Thurston asked the readers to donate money on behalf of Valadon, who has been diagnosed with consumption. His doctors say a drier climate is more fitting for the showman. Thurston even lists the contributions that come from his own company. He gives $50. Theo Bamberg gives $10. George White, $1. Other cast members give $1 or $2 for a total of $71. Then a letter to Thurston and Dr. Wilson, the editor of the Sphinx, is reprinted as well, and it says, "Dear Sirs, I hereby give you my consent to superintend a money collection on behalf of myself and agree to allow Dr. Wilson to have absolute control of the expenditure of this money. Thank you for your very kind endeavors. I remain sincerely yours, Paul Valadon." Enough money was raised for Paul and his son to relocate to Phoenix, Arizona, but a little over 1 year later, on April 23, 1913, 45-year-old Paul Valadon was dead from tuberculosis. He left his son with little money, or any at all. Valadon was buried in an unmarked grave in Greenwood Memory Park Cemetery. Young Paul was sent to an orphanage. In 1948, a dedication service was conducted by the magic group Mystic 13 and IBM Ring 55 in Phoenix for the grave marker that they had placed over Valadon's burial site. One other point of interest, Paul had a very elaborate scrapbook from his many years on the road, and I assume it stayed in the family, as Paul Jr., after he was released from the orphanage, he got married, had a child, and stayed in Phoenix. So, does anyone know about the whereabouts of this missing scrapbook? That's a good question. I might add one thing. Our fellow magicians do fall on hard times occasionally. I mean, everybody does, or can. Life can be cruel. Even with insurance, sometimes challenges with health issues can be devastating. I know the SAM started a fund for such things to help fellow magicians in need, but today we have GoFundMe pages to help individuals. And where I am here in Nashville, a fellow magician had a stroke sometime last year. And just to put a little bit into perspective, during COVID, this gentleman had some issues, one of which was discovering that he had a bunch of blood clots in his system, which left him in the hospital for quite a long time, and it was kind of touch and go. But he eventually made a recovery, and in 2023, he produced a show where it was a magic show where he talked about this recovery from difficult times. Then, unfortunately, in 2024, he had a stroke, and he was back to difficult times. His name is John Pica. If you can, spare $1 or $2 to help a fellow performer, I know it would be appreciated. Someone has set up a GoFundMe page for John Pica. And hey, if you can't, I understand that too. Times aren't the easiest. They haven't been for quite a while. But if you can help out, that would be awesome. Either way, thank you. I'll put a link to the GoFundMe page on the podcast page in the description for anybody that wants to help out. And wow, my friends, it's so exciting to be back with the podcast. I have so many episodes that I want to do this year. I've got some new things in store that I haven't even got around to. I kind of missed my big pile of books, which is what happens whenever I start doing research on these things. And around me right now, there's a dozen books at least that I've got to put back on the bookshelves. This one was really fun to research. I had a good time doing it. It did take some twists and turns, and it's even left with some questions, but it was fun. So that's going to do it for this episode of the Magic Detective Podcast. Until next time, I'm Dean Carnegie. I am the Magic Detective. Oh, and by the way, don't forget to check out some of my artwork on the Magic Detective group page. And until next time, please be well and stay safe.